And I don't know if we've shared this particular anecdote on the pod, but the first time I met you, which was almost a decade ago now, I
Good
was
God.
given sort of a warning that you might take a while to warm up to new people and you could be, a little bit, I don't know what's
Prickly?
prickly. Yeah. You could be a little bit prickly, a little bit just watching the situation before you get involved. And so I was prepared for you to be really mean. And then you were just lovely. Which apparently later I found out that you had been given your own speech about how you needed to be really nice to me because I was a sensitive flower.
Yes, and also because Frog really liked you
Well, that
and
worked
did
out for
not
both of us.
yeah, did not want you to be scared off.
Yeah, no, every
Um,
time I met their friends, I was like, "Oh, these people are so nice." So, it's all it's all good now.
yes. Um,
But the problem is now you've spoiled me with kindness, and if you were to insult me, I would cry. So, now you can only be nice to me.
yeah, there's no, insulty banter here, which, to be fair, is not how I generally interact with my friends these days. That was more a part of my life at one point.
Mhm. It's growth.
How do we do a podcast? I don't actually know.
Well, nobody's told us we're wrong yet, so whatever we're doing seems to be at least acceptable.
Yeah, I mean, to our small audience, who
Our small but cherished
scatter
audience.
across our small but cherished and ever-growing audience across 3 continents at
Hell
time of
yeah.
recording. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Fandom Apprentice, recorded from just one continent tonight.
That makes things logistically much easier.
Yes. And we are once again here with a lovely little in between bonus episode where we'll be talking about a hobbit.
The Hobbit, if you will.
I think we can apply to Bilbo the definite article,
Yeah.
considering it's the title of his book.
Yeah. I think that's fair.
So we talk, as you may have noticed if you've listened to our first, I almost called it our first season, but is it really? I don't know. It's not really. We weren't going to break it up into a season. Our coverage of the Fellowship of the Ring.
Mhm.
We do reference The Hobbit quite frequently, and that's because, as just a reminder to our audience, I read it over the phone to you over lockdown.
Yes, you did. And I have the copy of it that you read me here next to me, which is one of my very treasured possessions.
Yes. So we talked about The Hobbit quite a bit between the two of us. And then when you said you were going to read Lord of the Rings on your own, we decided to podcast about it. But
Mhm.
because we don't have coverage of The Hobbit, we felt like it was probably necessary for us to give a brief rundown of some of the bits in The Hobbit that perhaps are necessary for our audience to know so they're on the same page as we are.
Yeah, either from a plot perspective, because there are some events that come up or little and big themes that continue, but also The Hobbit sort of started some of the lines of interrogation and analysis that we're still using. And this is where we started to notice some of the themes like magic makes you dramatic and what cultures are we dealing with when we are, invading a goblin cave? Do the goblins have a right to fight back because you invaded their cave? How can we see things from the monster's perspective? So all of those sort of ideas or a lot of them anyway, started with The Hobbit. So it's fun to just revisit those as well.
Yeah. And I have my 2 copies of The Hobbit here. I have my 1 copy in English and my 1 copy in Latin.
I didn't know that you had a Latin copy of The Hobbit. That's fun.
I have a Latin copy of The Hobbit, which somebody fully went ahead and translated The Hobbit into Latin. Um, Mark Walker, who I believe is a classic scholar, and so, we have, instead of starting out with "In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit," we start with "In formine terrae habitabat hobbitus." And I took Latin in high school, so, um, I think my parents got that for me. I think my junior or senior year of high school, just as
Mhm.
a fun little, um, combination of 2 of my interests.
I would love
Um,
to look at that. And between my knowledge of The Hobbit and my knowledge of Romance languages, I could probably follow it decently well.
Maybe, yeah. I mean,
I could get
a
the
couple of
gist
years
for
back,
sure.
yeah, a couple of years ago, I was in a bookstore in Venice, which I think it's Libreria Acqua Alta. Yes, the High Water bookstore in Venice, which is a gorgeous, gorgeous bookstore. And I think I bought my dad, who is a more or less fluent Italian speaker, a copy of the second Harry Potter book in Italian.
Mhm.
And I knew those books very, very well as a youth. And so I basically tried to, and had some basic knowledge of Italian at the time. And so tried to basically read it on the flight home, and got partway through,
Yeah.
was able to figure out where I was in the story.
Well, that's like when I listen to my Percy Jackson podcast that's all in Spanish, and I do speak a good amount of Spanish, but not enough to follow a really fast conversation. But at least when they drop names, I'll hear Percy, Grover, Annabeth, and that'll at least anchor me in who we're talking about. It'll go da 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 Camp Half Blood. I'll say, okay, that's happening at camp. So if you have
Cool.
some familiar words and characters, then that makes it easier.
Yes. Um, and speaking of familiar words and characters, do we want to get started on this little dive into The Hobbit? Do we have
I would
anything
love
else to
that.
talk about?
No, I don't think so. I think, do we want to start with the sort of broader context as a story? Or did we want to do plot first?
I think we can do broader context as a story first. Um, the Hobbit was published in 1937, September 1937. And Tolkien says that he wrote the first line that came to him as he was grading papers. In a hole in the ground, there lived a hobbit. He wrote that sometime in like 1924, 1925, and then didn't do anything else with it for a few years. His oldest son, Michael, thinks that The Hobbit definitely began as a full story no later than 1929.
Hmm.
And it began as a bedtime story that Professor Tolkien told to his sons. And he would tell it to them apparently in front of the fire, with apparently with like his hands clasped behind his back as he was, if he's giving a great speech.
That's
And
amazing. I love that.
Christopher Tolkien said he sat them down at one point and he'd, grown up with stories, many stories that his father had told him. But one day he sat him and his brother down and said he was going to tell them a different story about a little creature called a hobbit. And apparently, according to Christopher Tolkien, who ended up becoming sort of the executor of Tolkien's estate and literary works after his death, it was in part because he was such a stickler for the details that his father started writing anything down.
Mhm.
because he'd sort of recap, what had happened the night before as he's telling the story the next night. And apparently, according to his older brother, Christopher Tolkien said at one point that he interrupted his father with, but you said that the door to Bag End was blue and Thorin's hood was green with a gold tassel. But tonight you're saying the door is green and Thorin's hat is a sky blue with a silver tassel. To which Tolkien said, "Damn the boy," strode over to his desk and started writing things down.
And there are so many places in The Hobbit where that exasperated dad spirit shines through so clearly. You'll have this very fun and clever elf song, and then some more description, and then the elves also sang several other songs that were just as good. Because if you're a parent or any adult making up a story for a kid and you have one really good thing, the kid will go, another one, do another elf song. You go, "Ah, fuck it, I don't know. They sang a bunch more songs. It's not important."
Right. You've got your plan. And we would, as we were reading this and as we've gone through Lord of the Rings, noted many points where we can relate it to a D&D campaign.
Mhm.
And the other thing about it being a children's story, because The Hobbit is unequivocally a children's story,
Yes,
right?
absolutely.
Is it has such a different tone than Lord of the Rings.
Oh, yes, it is nowhere near as bleak.
No, Lord of the Rings is bleak and it is dense all the way through, right? And The Hobbit has its dark moments, but in a very approachable manner.
Mhm.
There are deaths, there is destruction, there is evil in The Hobbit, but it's not presented in the same way that it is in Lord of the Rings.
And this is a connection that is only occurring in my brain now, but especially thinking about it as a children's story and the difference in the tone between the books. The Hobbit is so much about the joy of adventuring and how much there is to discover in this wonderful and exciting world. Whereas, and Bilbo's attitude reflects that. And that's a message that you want to convey to children, that the world is great and you can grow up and you can go on adventures and do all these incredible things. Whereas Fellowship, and presumably the next two books, are for after you've seen some shit and you've realized that the world is not as wonderful and thrilling of a place as you thought it was. And there's things that are beautiful and moving, and you can appreciate them because you've had more experiences to contextualize them. But also, you can learn about all the horrors and face all the darkness. And it's a much more adult perspective on the world and what you're going to discover when you go on an adventure.
Right. And also, I think, in some ways, the publication of Fellowship of the Ring follows the timeline of, the people who would have read The Hobbit as children, right?
Yeah.
Because The Hobbit was published in 1937, and Fellowship wasn't published until 1954. And so you have these people who were, between the ages of 7 and 13 in 1937, who then go through the Second World War, and then 10 years later are reading Lord of the Rings with that in the background.
Hmm.
It's still the world that they were introduced to back in 1937, but it's also now a world in which, in their day to day, they've seen and heard about such horror. They know
Yeah.
that these horrors exist. Anyway, The Hobbit, received fairly good reviews. And ultimately, Tolkien's publishers asked him for more about hobbits. And he said, "I cannot think of anything more to say about hobbits, but I have only too much to say and much already written about the world into which the hobbit intruded And he initially wanted to publish the Silmarillion, which we discussed last time, but ultimately ended up publishing Lord of the Rings. So he eventually, when he wrote Lord of the Rings, he wanted to bring in the hobbits as comic relief, as like the everyman hero, but with the world around them as dark and elemental to make their comedy and comedic nature stand out more in the future.
Mhm.
Um, he released an edited and updated version of The Hobbit in 1951. Initially, Chapter 5, Riddles in the Dark, had a very different format, with Bilbo taking the ring or receiving the ring willingly from Gollum. We'll discuss that when we go through our plot points, um, rather than tricking Gollum
Yeah.
and stealing the ring. But anyway, that's the like history of publication of The Hobbit. I think if you are, if you are following along with us in the same state that Sam is, with never having read Tolkien and not reading it at the same careful level that we are, going line by line through, The Hobbit is a, incredible place to begin. I think everyone should read it. I think it is a fun book. I think, that sounded that sounded skeptical. I think it's a very fun book. I think it's very funny. I had a I have a great time reading it. I go back to it, every year or so. And I hadn't for a few years until I read it to you, but it is one of my favorites.
It was interesting to go back to the text because there's an animated film that we'll talk about at some point in the future that I've now seen twice. But this was my first time since our read through that we did together actually looking at the book and going back through to do my summary. And it moves so fast. This book is quick, whereas
Mhm.
Lord of the Rings is reflective and ponderous, and we spend a lot of time looking at trees and water and doing deep introspective. The Hobbit is let's go, let's go, let's go, let's go. These kids are falling asleep. We have to get the plot moving. So if you are
Right, and
worried,
Tolkien, like,
yeah.
and Tolkien spends, like, in The Lord of the Rings, he notes every fucking day. He's like, "And dawn on the 3rd day had passed," right? Whereas in The Hobbit, he's like, "And 2 weeks later, they were here."
Yeah, if
You know,
you're worried about the denseness of fellowship, especially after our chapter on fuck. What's his name? The Council of the guy.
the Council of Elrond.
There we go. I subconsciously blocked it out. But yeah, if the description of the Council of Elrond, where I was just complaining for an episode and a half about how dense it was, if that put you off, The Hobbit does not have that problem.
Elrond is still in the book, but he's in the book for about a page.
Yeah. Yeah, no, he's chill.
Yeah, but I think it's an approachable text. I think it is, if you've enjoyed some of the things that we've talked about so far, but you haven't been reading along with us, I think The Hobbit is a great way to sort of whet your appetite for more, or to just have a deeper understanding of the world without bothering. You don't need to go on to Lord of the Rings, or you can. But I also think, one, it's important to be aware that they're not the same type of story. They're not presented in the same tone, they're not presented in the same way. But that said, I think The Hobbit is an important starting point. So, yes, are we starting at our starting point now, a full book into the series? Yes, leave us alone.
Yeah.
Or
And
don't,
just as a
actually. Take us
last
with you on your ears.
Yeah. Just as a last pitch for how accessible it is in terms of being easy to get, every library is going to have a zillion fucking copies of The Hobbit. If you have Libby, if you have Kindle Unlimited, if you have whatever, it is so easy to get your hands on this text. So if you're curious, just see what your library has. Your bookstore is going to have a million of them if you want to buy it, but it's not a hard book to find.
No, no, no. So, if we want to give just a quick, I guess, for the rest of this episode, a quick rundown of the events of The Hobbit and any sort of important themes, songs, references we've made, recurrent characters that we see in Lord of the Rings. I guess we can go through the plot of The Hobbit. So if you know, want to read The Hobbit with fresh eyes, knowing nothing, you can stop here and come back to this afterwards, and that way we can you can then learn about all of our little gay pieces that we insert into this book.
I wish I could come up with a joke about gay pieces and inserting, but we're just going to move along unless you have a really good one.
Bilbo inserts his gay little piece into Thranduil later at the end. Uh,
Is Bilbo? You know, he could be a top. He could be a switch. Anyway, so just the ultimate shortest 2 sentence summary is The Hobbit is Bilbo's journey. It takes place 60 years ish before the events of Fellowship. I Googled it and several sources said that it was 60 years. So I'm going to assume that
it
that's true.
is.
And basically, what happens is it's the story of how Bilbo sets out on his very first adventure. He gets the ring and he helps a bunch of dwarves defeat the dragon Smog and retake their ancestral home. So that's in broad strokes what happens. And I have my little outline that we can just kind of ping pong between, and any things that we want to talk about, we can. I think that I mostly want to focus on the beginning, sort of the set dressing, riddles in the dark, and the ending. I think those are the three
I
like biggest
would agree
parts.
with that. I think a couple of recurring characters that we see right in this beginning are Bilbo. We've seen him in The Hobbit, or
Yeah, I
God,
hope we see him in The
uh,
Hobbit.
we've seen Bilbo in Fellowship so far, and Gandalf. Right? There are, Gandalf is our instigator, our agent of the plot, and here we have him showing up. We have a description of Bilbo and his home, and then Gandalf shows up and is like, "Hey, I need a thief." And Bilbo's like, "I'm sorry, dude, you're in the wrong fucking place."
Yeah, he goes, what the fuck? And Gandalf has a reputation for doing this. He has a reputation for a lot of things in the Shire, that he's a storyteller, he's tricks and trinkets, and oh, you're the guy who gave my uncle the magic cufflinks that don't come undone unless you order them to. Very harmless little things. And also occasionally sending quiet lads and lasses out on grand adventures. And the first time that we read this, I didn't notice the lads and lasses part. And I will take
Mhm.
any reference to women, no matter how small. So there have been some lady hobbits who have gone on adventures thanks to Gandalf, which I would love to know more about those. But this
Well,
is just
it
kind of a thing that
also
he does. Mhm.
it also mentions, now that you say that, the page that I have open, right? Um, that Bilbo's mother was the famous Belladonna Took, one of 3 remarkable daughters of the old Took. So,
Mhm.
and it says later, not that that Belladonna Took ever had any adventures after she became Mrs. Bungo Baggins, which kind of implies that she had
Ooh.
adventures before she got married.
Give me the fanfics, please. They have to be out there.
Yes, give me the
Want that
Belladonna
so
Took
bad.
adventure stories.
Oh, I would love that. But anyway, this we're not here for Belladonna, but I'm just happy to think about her. But Bilbo basically goes, no, no, sorry, I'm not a burglar. I have no idea what you're talking about. And then Gandalf just springs an entire party of 12 dwarves on him at his house the next day. And Bilbo is too polite and confused to kick them out,
Yes, and our party of dwarves,
which
which
I
I'm just
expect
gonna
you have
run
this list
down the list.
memorized. Yes.
Surprisingly, no, not off the top of my head. I could probably do most of it. Here, let me see what I can do off the top of my head.
Okay.
Balin, Dwalin, Dory, Nori, and Ori, Feely, Keely, Biffer, Boffer, Bomber, Oin, Gloin. That's 12. And of course, the leader of the party, Thorin Oakenshield.
Very good, Bestie. I tried to run through it from memory before we started, but I kept forgetting Nori. Sorry, Nori.
It's fine. Nori has no speaking lines, so
Yeah, most of
um
them don't speak.
Balin, Bomber, Dory, and I think Feely and Keely have speaking lines, and of course Thorin.
Mhm.
So just under half. So it's 13 dwarves show up on his fucking doorstep. 13 dwarves and a wizard. And of course, hobbits are so big on hospitality. He's thrown for a loop by this, but goes, "All right, well, come in and have tea, I guess."
And Gandalf plays on this expectation of Hobbit hospitality and saying, "Oh, aren't you going to feed them? Get out some meat, get out some wine, get the stuff, Bilbo. Come on, you know what's happening here." And Bilbo just goes, "Oh, okay, sure, I guess." So this giant unexpected party gets going, and the dwarves lay out their plan to retake Erebor, the Lonely Mountain, which the dragon Smog has occupied for some very long period of time.
I believe it's like 70 years at least.
Yeah.
So,
So
which
it's
is
been,
longer than Bilbo's been alive at this point.
yes, it's within at least Thorin's living memory. You know, he remembers
Mhm.
living there and when it was this great center of their civilization. So relatively recent, but still a good long time, and they're going to need help to take it back. And they sing some songs, and there's two songs with vastly different vibes. There's one about breaking plates, which Bilbo's very afraid they're going to do. And that's just sort of silly bedtime story, haha, dwarf song. But then there's the Misty Mountain song, which I think probably a lot of people have heard little clips of because it's very famous. And it's mournful and atmospheric and beautiful. And it tells this whole story of how their home was lost. And that really starts to stir up Bilbo's tookish nature that we've been talking about in Fellowship with Frodo. Um, and it said, something tookish woke up inside him, and he wished to go and see great mountains and hear pine trees in the waterfalls and explore the caves and wear a sword instead of a walking stick. And that's the moment where his desire for adventure is really awakened, even if he doesn't fully realize it yet.
Right, but then, like, the very next line, and so, he shuddered, and very quickly he was plain Mr. Baggins of Bag End Underhill again.
Mhm.
he he wants no adventures for now, but he's not going to get a choice, right?
No.
Because they make their plan, they leave, and he wakes up the next morning and goes about his day until Gandalf shows up on his doorstep and goes, "We gave you a bit of a fright. You haven't even dusted the mantelpiece this morning." And of course, there's a note on the mantelpiece from Thorne and company saying, "We'll expect you at the Green Dragon Inn in Bywater at 11 a.m. sharp," and it's 10:45.
Mhm.
So I do love this little exchange. Is that leaves you just 10 minutes? You'll have to run," said Gandalf. "But," said Bilbo, "no time for it," said the wizard. "But," said Bilbo again, "no time for that either. Off you go."
And just the level of sass to place this note under the clock on the mantle because he somehow knows that Bilbo is going to dust the mantle in the morning. And that's just his cheeky little place where he's going to put the note instead of somewhere obvious and convenient.
Because fucking dramatic fucking wizards.
Yeah, from the very
Um,
beginning.
yeah. But anyway, they go off. Bilbo runs out, unfortunately, with no hat, no coat, and no pocket handkerchief, which will be a source of consternation through the rest of this adventure.
So true. Pocket handkerchiefs are very useful, and we've both become big advocates for pocket handkerchiefs, in no small part due to this book.
Definitely partially due to this book, although for me, I bought a bunch of hankies for flagging purposes. Which, if you are a queer person and you are not familiar with hanky code, um, I advise you to look up the Wikipedia article on it. It's wonderful and very useful. So I bought them
I
for
remember when
flagging
we explained
purposes.
it to a friend when we were waiting in line for a Monoskin, and we were making some references to it, and he was asking what we were talking about, and we were saying, "We can tell you, but once you know, you can't unknow. So,
Well, it's
just decide if
specifically
you want
because of
this.
what I was flagging too.
And also because of other people who were walking by. It was a whole conversation, but we don't need to
Yeah,
reveal those
yeah.
details.
I won't reveal the details, but just he, I believe, does know now. So
Yeah. So,
our
congratulations. But you got a variety pack that included some ones that you are not going to use for that purpose.
no, but I will use for blowing my nose.
Yeah, it's handy.
Yeah. Anyway, they go off on their adventure.
They don't even wait
And
17 years. They just do it immediately.
no, no. And I keep forgetting every time I read this book, I forget that chapter 2 involves the trolls.
Yeah, it happens right away. And these are the same trolls that we've referenced because they encounter them again at the beginning of Fellowship. And this is Bilbo's first encounter with danger. And there are these trolls that are sitting around a fire and being very scary and menacing. All the dwarves get tied up in sacks, and Bilbo has to rescue them with Gandalf's help, and it's very exciting. And then after they defeat the trolls, they have this big cave of treasure, which is great. I mean, they're going to a giant mountain that's also going to be full of treasure, so they leave most of it. But this is where Bilbo gets the blade that he will eventually name Sting.
Yes, and Sting will eventually get passed down to Frodo in Fellowship.
Mhm.
And then chapter 3 is entitled A Short Rest. And if any of them were warlocks, they'd get their spell slots back, but they don't.
Well, they can at least roll some hit dice.
Um,
It's fine.
yes, because they have a short rest in Rivendell, which we have encountered before, um, where Elrond lives in the last homely house. And the descriptions here really help you see that, like, at this point, Tolkien did not have planned out Lord of the Rings, right? When you read uh, about the last homely house, it doesn't read quite as much as, a whole elven city. You know, Elrond doesn't read quite as much like, an elven lord as he does
Mhm.
in Fellowship. He's definitely wise and he's uh definitely a great source of information and a good place to rest, but it's not quite the same as we read in Fellowship.
Yeah. But it does begin Bilbo's love for elves and their culture. And that's something that he passes on to Frodo. He teaches him Elvish, and he continues to be an elf friend for the rest of his life. So, this is the starting point of that for him.
Right. And he will ultimately teach Frodo Elvish, which Frodo will forget at every convenient opportunity.
Frodo's clearly not a very
Um,
good student, or at least forgets
no.
things under pressure, as so many of us do.
Um, but here is where they find that the heirloom map that Thorin has magical letters on it detailing a back door into the mountain, and also that the swords that they took from the trolls, two of them are very ancient, very powerful blades named Orcrist the Goblin Cleaver and Glamdring the Foe Hammer. And Gandalf wields Glamdring and Thorin wields Orcrist. But anyway, they find out information about their where they're headed to this secret door, and they get a timeline that they will need to complete this by Durin's Day.
Mhm.
And then we have Overhill and Underhill, which leads them up into the mountains where they encounter the goblins.
Yeah, so they head out into the Misty Mountains and they take shelter in a cave during a storm and they think it's going to be safe, but then their ponies start disappearing. Turns out goblins are eating them and they go have a big confrontation with the goblins and Gandalf saves the day again. But Bilbo,
Yeah.
unfortunately, hits his head and gets dropped down a hole and lands in another sub cave.
Yes. And this is where we get chapter 5, Riddles in the Dark. And Riddles in the Dark
This is
is
oh, you go.
the most important chapter to Lord of the Rings in The Hobbit,
This is
right?
where we get the ring.
This is where we get the ring, this is where we get the setup for the fact that this ring is a powerful artifact, and potentially corrupting. Um, and we've talked before about catabasis, this journey into the underworld to gain knowledge and power and rise again from death because he's assumed by his companions to be dead and gone.
Mhm. And
Um,
basically, what happens during this part is, Bilbo wakes up in the cave. He doesn't really know where he is. He finds this ring, sticks it in his pocket, and then he happens upon Gollum, who is described so terrifyingly. We haven't really gotten a good look at him in Fellowship at this point, but in The Hobbit, the word slimy is used multiple times to describe him, and he's just this creepy underwater cave creature, and he's very unsettling. And Gollum challenges him to a riddle contest. And if Bilbo wins, Gollum will show him the way out. And I don't remember if Gollum explicitly says that he's going to eat Bilbo if he loses, but if he doesn't say it out loud, it's definitely implied.
um, let's see. It doesn't actually say. Oh, it asks us, yes, if we asks and it doesn't answer, we eats it, my precious. If
Yes.
it asks us and we doesn't answer, then we does what it wants, eh? We shows it the way out. Yes. So they have a riddle
And
contest, which echoes all sorts of mythology. And we talked in our last episode about Tolkien's influences, his background in mythology, and riddles appear in Greco-Roman mythology. They appear in um, Hebrew myths. They appear in uh, old Sanskrit and Persian mythology, Old Norse, Celtic mythology. So, Tolkien would have been very familiar with the trading of riddles.
this is in a meta way canonical to the world as well, and Bilbo acknowledges that riddle contests are an ancient and honored tradition. So even though Gollum is clearly evil, he will probably abide by the terms that they've set. So they have their
Right.
riddle contest, which Bilbo wins, and shockingly Gollum does not keep his word, and Bilbo has to use some trickery to get the fuck out of there.
Interesting. Well, part it's because to Gollum, Bilbo didn't keep his word.
This is true. His last riddle is a trick,
Right. It's the very famous, "What do I have in my pockets? What have I
which is
got in my
not a riddle.
pockets?" Just not a riddle, it's a guessing game. And Gollum makes 3 guesses and gets them all wrong. And yes, Gollum was intending to trick Bilbo by using the ring, which turns you invisible, and he'll show him the way out if Bilbo can find him while he's invisible. Trickery is a time-honored mythological tradition as well,
Yeah.
and Bilbo just one-upped him on the trickery there. But now we
So,
have the ring.
mhm, yes.
And so Bilbo makes it out and reunites with his party, but crucially here, does not tell his party about the ring or the truth about how he escaped.
Yes. And even eventually later on, when the party finds out that he has the ring, he does not tell them how he got it. That information is not made public until Fellowship, when Gloin finally learns the truth.
Yes. and then they're still not safe from the goblins. The goblins come out at night, chase them up a bunch of trees, and sing a little song about how they're 15 birds and 5 fir trees. They set fire to the trees. And Gandalf ultimately calls his friend the Lord of the Eagles. They're rescued by the Eagles, fed, and ultimately dropped off where they go, and they meet not a friend of Gandalf's, but an acquaintance known as Beorn.
I love Beorn. I love him so much.
Well, and in Fellowship, we've referenced the Beornings, who are descendants of Beorn or his people. Um, and Beorn is a bear.
Both the gay kind and the shapeshifter kind.
Yes, he is a man that can become a bear. And yeah, this is definitely a gay man.
He lives in a charming house with pastures for all of his bees and little animals that he's taught how to throw tea parties. And he just lives this delightful cottagecore life. And also, he's
Yes, while
literally a
also
bear.
being giant and muscular. And um, I also love the illustration that Tolkien has of Beorn's Hall that he puts in the book.
Mhm.
So there are a few illustrations that Tolkien did because it sort of closely resembles the inside of like a Viking mead hall.
Yeah.
And Beorn is such a character direct out of the sagas, right? Last time we talked about Bodvar Bjarki, the warrior who sort of closely matches up with Beowulf. Again, Beorn just literally means bear.
Mhm.
Um, it's an Anglicization of Bjorn, which is the Norse word for bear, and he can turn into a bear, much like Bodvar Bjarki in Hrolfkraki's saga can also turn into a bear in battle, right? So this is just Tolkien lifting a character from a saga and a story that he's familiar with and putting him direct in his children's story that he's telling to his kids.
And it totally works. And there's a kind of callback to the beginning of the story with tricking someone into letting a bunch of dwarves into their home, in that they sort of trickle in the entire party because Gandalf warns them that Beorn is not going to be thrilled to have the total of 14 of them in his house. So they just send a couple in at a time until they've all found their way into his hall, which thankfully can accommodate them, and they tell stories and they have a wonderful meal. And then Beorn sends them off with some ponies that are on loan specifically because he treasures his animals and their first ponies got eaten. So he's not going to trust anybody to walk away with ponies that he cannot guarantee will return. And he escorts them in bear shape to Mirkwood.
Yes. And then we get into Mirkwood, which is a creepy, dark, enchanted forest.
It is the opposite of Lorien. It's bad news bears.
Bad news spiders, actually.
Oh, yes. It's creepy and it's super dark, and you shouldn't touch the water and don't stray from the path. And there's giant spiders, and everything is awful. They got
They
a lot
say
of
about 7
warnings.
times, yeah, Gandalf doesn't come with them through Mirkwood. But both Beorn and Gandalf warn them not to stray from the path. And what do they fucking do? Stray from the path, of course,
Of course they do.
obviously.
Mhm.
So they sort of variously are trying to find the elves for help because they run out of food and water, and then get captured by spiders, and then try to find the elves again, and instead now get taken prisoner by the elves.
Yes, and quickly with the spiders, this is another sort of turning point for Bilbo, in that the dwarves get all tied up again, this time in spider webs, and Bilbo rescues them again, and he kills a spider with his sword, and that's the moment where he names it Sting, and he has another sort of awakening and growing in confidence as an adventurer. This is sort of his first blood. And yeah, like you said, they try 3 times to get the elves to help because the elves are just appearing in this kind of fey pocket dimension where suddenly they're there in the middle of the woods feasting. And the dwarves go, "Oh, thank God, we're starving and we have no water. Please help us." And then they disappear again. And the elves take Thorin prisoner and they ask him why the dwarves were attacking their people. And Thorin goes, "They weren't attacking you. They were just trying to survive." And they go, "Well, sucks to suck. We're going to take the rest of your party prisoner too." And we have a little bit of a reference to this during the Council of Elrond when Loin is complaining about why they didn't let the dwarves out for nice little walks in the moonlight like they do with Gollum in Fellowship, because their imprisonment is miserable. But Bilbo is
Yes.
able to stay out because of the ring.
And because Bilbo stays out, he manages to sneak around, take messages to people, and he figures out how to get them all out.
Mhm.
Um, and he gets them all out by shoving them in barrels that are now empty of wine and floating them up the river to Lake Town. And I think we've referenced the fact that Lake Town is a gay commune before.
Yes.
Um, and the theory behind this is one, no women are ever mentioned pretty much anywhere in this book, but particularly in Lake Town. And then also in that animated 1977 Hobbit film we mentioned before, uh, they're all of the men pictured in Lake Town are all wearing very short tunics
And
with their
no
legs.
pants as far as we can tell.
Yeah, including in the battle later.
Yeah.
Um, no pants, just some nice short tunics that stop just below the ass.
And they're
So,
all shredded. They're all clearly in like their 20s to 40s. They're all jacked. They're all, especially in the animated film, 70s beauty standard. They are
yeah,
just, this is a free
wild
love
mustaches.
colony. Yeah,
Wild mustaches. So, definitely a gay free love commune. Um,
absolutely.
but they make it to Lake Town where Thorin reveals that he is the heir to the throne of, the king under the mountain. He is
Mhm.
he is supposed to be king in Erebor, were it not for Smaug. So he's welcomed, and um, they are able to have a little rest, a little help preparing for their journey to Erebor, and then they head
And
for Erebor,
where there
I
is a
guess.
secret door, which they had to wait for a thrush to knock at sunset on Durin's day. And it's all very convenient that they get there at exactly the day that they need to be there. And so they open this big secret door into the mountain, and the dwarves bravely send Bilbo in first. And they say, "Okay, burglar, there you go. This is your time." And Bilbo is not thrilled about this, but he goes in, he sees Smog, he steals a cup from him.
And
We have the
that
our Mhm,
we talked last time a lot about Beowulf. This is a direct scene out of Beowulf.
mhm,
Um, ultimately, in there's a dragon towards the tail end of Beowulf, and what ultimately provokes that dragon's wrath is a man going in and stealing a cup.
mhm.
And later on, this is what will provoke the dragon's wrath. Is the fact that there was a stolen piece of treasure, and he goes after Lake Town because of it. Um,
Yeah.
but the dragon and Beowulf can't speak. So Bilbo has a conversation with Smaug and another game of riddles with him, where he tries to sort of riddle about who he is. But he says, let's see, where is the one of the lines? He greets Smaug as the chiefest and greatest of calamities. Smaug the Tremendous. And Smaug says, "You have nice manners for a thief and a liar.
Mhm.
You seem familiar with my name, but I don't remember smelling you before. Who are you and where do you come from? May I ask?" Bilbo says, "You may indeed. I come from under the hill, and under the hills and over the hills my paths led, and through the air I am he that walks unseen, the clue finder, the web cutter, the stinging fly. I was chosen for the lucky number. I am he that buries his friends alive and drowns them and draws them alive again from the water. I come from the end of a bag, but no bag went over me. I am the friend of bears and the guest of eagles, ring winner and luck wearer, and I am barrel rider. And that is where he dooms Lake Town.
Mhm.
So,
And the
uh,
reason that he dooms Lake Town is because Smaug is familiar with the commerce between um the last homely house and Lake Town, and that they send barrels full of goods down the river, and that's how they trade things. So he says barrel rider, and then he assumes that Bilbo is from Lake Town, and so then he blames Lake Town for this intrusion.
right. He also does note that he ate ponies that tasted of dwarves.
This is true, yes.
Um, but Smog gets very angry when Bilbo steals the cup and ultimately you know, roars out of the cave, collapsing the side door and trapping Bilbo and his companions inside the mountain while Smog goes to destroy Lake Town.
Mhm.
But anyway, but Smog never comes back because Bard the guardsman kills Smog.
He's got a weak spot where there's one scale on his belly that's exposed. So he uses his black arrow to shoot him down. It's all very dramatic.
Because he understands the speech of birds.
Oh,
Um,
yes, yes.
and it's a bird that tells Bard about this. And that was, a combination of two different myths, including from the saga of the Volsungs, where Sigurd kills Fafnir and some of Fafnir's blood gets in his mouth and he can understand the speech of birds and learns that his brother is going to kill him. I'm sorry, not his brother, Fafnir's brother and the foster father of Sigurd.
Ah, okay.
And the other piece of this where this is relayed is in the Song of Hiawatha, which is a poem by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Anyway, clearly those were both influences on Tolkien. But the dwarves go into the treasure room.
And they see all of the amazing loot, and they're talking about, oh, this is this great sword that this great guy made, and this is this other awesome thing. And they sort of go through all of these great lost treasures of their civilizations. And this is where Bilbo gets his mithril shirt that he will later give to Frodo.
Mhm.
And Bilbo also finds the Arkenstone, which is my favorite thing. I love the Arkenstone. I think everything that happens with it is so cool. So I want to talk about it. And
Okay.
the Arkenstone is the big thing that Thorin wants more than anything else. It is the most valuable item in this entire hoard of infinite riches. And Bilbo finds it and puts it in his pocket and does not tell anyone. And he is, by contract, entitled to 1/14 of the total treasure. And so he reasons, this is probably worth about a 14th of all the stuff, maybe, and just sort of spirits it away. And as they're getting deeper and deeper into all of this treasure, Thorin is corrupted by the dragon sickness that is partially because of Smaug's influence, partially because of a predisposition to corruption that dwarves have when it comes to riches, in that he just becomes single-mindedly obsessed with the treasure and not sharing it.
Yeah, and this again is a reference to uh, the saga of the Volsungs, where Fafnir steals the treasure of Andvari the dwarf, and that's ultimately what makes him a dragon. Is because he gets so greedy and so concerned about somebody stealing his treasure.
And there's all of this confrontation with the men of Lake Town, who are rightly entitled to some of the treasure because they're the ones who killed Smog, and Smog stole a bunch of stuff from them too. But
Mhm.
Thorin refuses to speak with them, and camps of elves and camps of men, everybody who is aware that this treasure is basically up for grabs, starts trying to stake their claim to it. And it becomes a whole thing and very tense. And Bilbo sneaks away from the dwarves with the Arkenstone and gives it to Bard as a bargaining chip for Lake Town to say, hey, show Thorin that you have this and he will speak with you. And Thorin is incensed. He's betrayed that Bilbo has taken this great treasure, banishes Bilbo with all of these extremely harsh words. And then that builds up to the Battle of the Five Armies, which is not that exciting of a battle. Um, we know from what we've talked about with Tolkien's life, and I don't know if we've talked about it in Fellowship specifically, but he doesn't glorify battle. This is not the climactic point of the book. It's really sad and bleak and tragic. This is one of those darker moments. But the five armies
Right.
are the men of Lake Town, the elves of Mirkwood, dwarves, goblins, and wargs, which are the giant wolves.
And ultimately, the Eagles come and make a sixth army.
Yeah. There's some debate
Um,
online about what you would count as the five armies, but that seemed to be the most agreed upon breakdown.
right. The ultimately it starts off as the men of Lake Town and the elves of Mirkwood allied together against the dwarves
Mhm.
because Thorin sends for his cousin Dane from the Iron Hills to come and help lay claim to the treasure. Between when Bilbo steals the cup and when the battle happens is like a 2 or 3 week period.
Mhm.
It's at least a week after Lake Town is destroyed before the dwarves hear anything further. And then Dane shows, and they're sort of about to get into battle when Gandalf shows back up,
Mhm.
you know, as an agent of the plot and goes, so there's a bunch of goblins coming, and you're all going to need to band together to defeat them. And goblins are the enemies of all. Um, but the real reason this battle is not terribly exciting, other than Tolkien doesn't glorify battle, like Sam said, is Bilbo gets knocked out halfway through it.
Yeah. Bilbo is a lot of things. He's not a soldier. He's grown, but he hasn't grown in that direction. He's not going to fight in this battle. He gets bonked on the head.
He gets bonked on the head while invisible.
Mhm.
And unlike D&D, it's not a concentration spell. So he stays invisible. So ultimately, after the battle's over, people are searching for him, and they can't find him because he's not able to be seen. But ultimately, he wakes back up, and somebody finds him from the sound of his voice. I want to point out one of the lines here in chapter 18, The Return Journey,
Mhm.
which is the second to last chapter of the book. But he says, victory after all, I suppose, he said, feeling his aching head. Well, it seems a very gloomy business, right? Because even though, they won, quote unquote, there is still ultimately loss because Thorin dies.
Yeah. And Fili and Keely die too, right?
Fili and Kili die too, and they're the youngest members of the party.
Yeah. They're sort of
Um,
our there are Pippin times too. There are youngsters, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, eager for the
yeah,
journey, and they're so lovely, and then they fucking die.
and I want to read to this little piece because it's one of my favorite sections of this entire book,
Mhm.
right? Where you know, as we said before, sort of Thorin had gotten super mad at Bilbo and banished him, and calls him to his deathbed. says, I wish to part in friendship from you, and I would take back my words and deeds at the gate. And Bilbo says, farewell, this is a bitter adventure if it must end so, and not a mountain of gold can amend it. Yet I am glad that I have shared in your perils. It has been more than any Baggins deserves. And Thorin says, no, there is more in you of good than you know, child of the kindly West. Some courage and some wisdom blended in measure. If more of us valued food and cheer and song above hoarded gold, it would be a merrier world. And I don't know what to do with that
That's
besides
the message of the
cry.
book right there. You did
That
cry when
is
you were
the
reading it to
that
me.
is I cry every time I read that line. It is the message of the entire story, right? Is Bilbo is a creature of food and cheer and song. And it is only through, embracing those parts of himself, in addition to his adventurous side, that he's able to complete his adventure.
And that's what really got us started on our kick about Hobbit masculinity and Hobbit genders, in that all of those aspects of peace and comfort and domesticity that Bilbo embodies are what allow him to be successful. And they're integral to his character. These aren't weaknesses that he has to overcome. They are ultimately the most important things about him, the most important things in the world. And he is complex and he grows and he learns new skills and he has to face danger. But at the end of the day, those core values are the things that he needs to hang on to and the things that Thorin recognizes in him as being so important.
Yes. Um, and as Bilbo leaves Erebor, he takes a small amount of gold with him on his just a small fraction of the treasure he's owed, right? To
Mhm.
return home with. Um, and I had done the math out at one point when we were discussing this ourselves, and I have it written down somewhere where it says he takes one pony and two chests of gold home, gold and silver and jewels, right? If we assume that it's a pony on the larger side that can carry about 250 pounds of gold, in 2023 dollars, that's $6 million worth of gold. Even if we say half of that silver, that's $40,000 worth of silver in 2023 dollars. And we know some of it was jewels because later it mentions he travels home with Gandalf and the elves and Beorn. And along the way, he gives the elf king a pearl necklace.
Does he now?
He does. Yes. Brought in a necklace of silver and pearls is
And
the
this he
exact
gives
line.
to Thranduil, not to God, what's his fucking name? I keep forgetting. It's Elrond.
No, Thranduil is the elf king, although he's never named in this book. But
Mhm.
Thranduil is the elf king and the father of Legolas, who we see in Fellowship. And so when we say Thranduil, king of the elves in Mirkwood, who canonically fucks, this is why.
Yes. Canonically fucks.
Is
Canonically
because
is fucked.
canonically he got a pearl necklace from Bilbo Baggins,
What an honor. What a
which if
treat.
you don't know what we're talking about, Urban Dictionary it.
Yeah, Google it. We'll figure it out.
Or listen to Moment Silence by Hosier. Oh, one of the other lines as he's leaving the Lonely Mountain, Bilbo says, if ever you are passing my way, don't wait to knock. Tea is at 4, but any of you are welcome at any time.
Love that.
Again, the domesticity, the hospitality that's so essential to him.
The full circle that now they're actually welcome in his home as opposed to the first time when they were unexpected and unwanted.
Right. And we get a epilogue for Beorn, right? The men of his line hunted out the goblins from the mountains. In this little one-page epilogue for Beorn, we see really that Tolkien didn't intend to write more for this story,
Yeah.
right? Um, in their day, the last goblins were hunted from the Misty Mountains, and a new peace came over the edge of the wild. Okay, but not by 70 years later when we're reading Fellowship.
Yeah.
So that may perhaps come to pass, but not in the direct sequels. One of the lines here, too, at the end of this chapter is the Tookish part was getting very tired and the Baggins daily getting stronger.
Mhm.
That little spark of adventure, it exists, but again, the other part of him was never driven out.
Yeah. And his desire for adventure was satisfied. He'd had enough, and then he was perfectly happy to be at home for a nice long time.
Yes. And he shows back up at home a full year later. He spends the winter with Beorn, heads back out in the spring, gets to Rivendell, and then heads home finally over a year later to find to
That everything
find
is
what does he
just as he
find,
left it,
Sam?
and it's no, it's oh my god. So he has been assumed dead, clearly, and
Mhm.
all of his belongings are being auctioned off. I don't remember if the Sackville-Bagginses were in charge of this or if they were just very present in the whole thing, but he has to spend a long time convincing people that he is Bilbo Baggins and he is alive and please give his things back. And he ends up buying a lot of his own stuff back just to make it easier because he doesn't want to have to negotiate with people. But he has to put his life back together.
Yes, and the Sackville-Bagginses are the villains of the first, like, 2 chapters of Fellowship.
The Sackville
And
Bagginses are the villains of everything. They're terrible.
we are an anti-Sackville-Baggins podcast.
Bilbo did not offer them any tea. That is, I
No,
mean, I think that's everything you need to know.
because many of his silver spoons mysteriously disappeared and were never accounted for. Personally, he suspected the Sackville-Bagginses.
Yeah, and his suspicion was right. That's confirmed in Fellowship.
Um, and it says at one point, on their side, they never admitted that the returned Baggins was genuine. They basically straight up denied that he was actually Bilbo when he got back.
Yeah.
Just a fun little throwaway line. But then we get a line that has sparked our entire viewing of Hobbits for Fellowship and all the rest of the books that we will read. He was held by all the hobbits of the neighborhood to be queer, except by his nephews and nieces on the Took side. And that's because the Tooks are also gay as shit.
Yeah.
Even though Frodo is not a Took, Frodo is a Baggins through and through, but Frodo is definitely another little young gay man who gets brought to live with his gay uncle.
Hmm.
But yeah, that basically sums it up. We get a lovely one last page in which Balin shows up and fills Bilbo in on the happenings of the last several years while he's been away, and they drink tea and tell stories, and Bilbo settles in to write his memoirs. So that's The Hobbit.
Yeah, it's the Hobbit in very quick, broad strokes anyway. But like we said at the outset, in terms of it being a book for children, it has very clear themes that are very explicit and easily digestible. Um, they're still profound and thought provoking, but they don't really take a lot of work to figure out what the story is trying to tell us about greed and peace and the value of food and drink and good cheer.
Mm-hmm.
And hopefully that's helpful in terms of contextualizing the rest of Fellowship and our approach to it.
Yeah, that was why we wanted to do this episode. Was just to make sure that this was available for the podcast. We're not going to spend a bunch of episodes going through chapter by chapter, like we do with Fellowship or with our next couple of books, but just so we can occasionally reference The Hobbit and not feel like we're leaving parts of our audience behind.
Mhm. And it would probably be really interesting. I don't know if we have inspired anyone to read or reread these books. If you have started with Fellowship and then go back to read The Hobbit, that would probably be really interesting to see Bilbo in his glory days, in his youth, as like a little prequel.
Yeah. I would be very interested to know more about your experience with that. So if that is how you've read it, send us an email at thephantomapprentice@gmail.com or a DM on one of our social medias at fanappod on Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok.
That's three P's, Fanapapapod.
FANAPPPOD.
Thank you, Bestie.
Sammy,
Yes.
do we have anything else we want to discuss for The Hobbit? I know you and I can talk about The Hobbit for days on end, but
And we have.
and
And
we
we will continue
have,
to.
and we will continue to. And honestly, is that not just what this podcast is? And it is an extension of our discussions about The Hobbit.
Yeah, I don't think I have anything else specific. I'm excited to get into the Two Towers and
Yes.
continue. I feel like I'm in a really good spot right now where I've now read two books in this world and I've got two more that are sort of a continuation of this main story. So I just get to be in this nice cushy spot where I know enough, I have background knowledge, and I have more to look forward to. And it's not the dread of, oh, I love this series and it's about to end and there's only one more book. There's still plenty to go. So I'm feeling good. I'm just ready to continue. And it's nice to revisit this cozy, simple story before things inevitably get really bleak.
Yeah, things heat up in the Two Towers, and even more so in Return of the King. I promise, even when we only have one book left of the trilogy, you won't be feeling like, "Oh, no, it's about to end." You'll be feeling like, "What the fuck is gonna happen now?"
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, dear listeners, thank you for sticking with us through our little couple of bonus episodes here. But yeah, next time, I think we'll pick up with the first couple of chapters of Two Towers. I need to set out a recording schedule for how we're going to break up Two Towers.
Mhm.
I have not yet done that,
We got time.
but we got a little time. And at the time of recording, um, Sam and I are going to hang out in person shortly. And
Yes, I'm
so
very excited for that.
we'll figure out where we're going from here.
Yeah. And if you like the show, if you want to bring some more friends on the adventure with you, word of mouth is the best way for a podcast to grow. Just by far, it is the most effective thing because people trust their friends. Nobody wants to click on an ad or click on a random thing they see if it's not being endorsed by someone they like. So if you know somebody who you think might enjoy the show, please share it with them. We have talked about potentially more ideas for more silly bonus content or more niche bonus content that we might release if we get to certain listener subscriber milestones that can be worked out in the future. But if you're enjoying this sort of extra stuff, we have a lot of ideas and we have a lot of deleted scenes from previous episodes and things that we would be more than happy to give you in exchange for more tributes slash friends,
um,
companions.
Yes, I'm
Sacrifices.
just a couple of little sprinkles. If you want to hear what Aragorn did to our sexuality, or rankings of how queer the Lord of the Rings characters are, or us continue to talk about D&D and its relationship to Lord of the Rings, those are all possibilities that we've discussed. But in the meantime, we'll be talking about book content from here on for now. You were saying, Sammy?
Oh, I was just gonna say, like we talked about last time, we'll probably enable the Q&A feature on Spotify if you have ideas for other bonus content or just general things you would like to hear us talk about. We're always down.
Please, yes. We know we have some wildly varied academic and non-academic interests as they relate to these books, but if you have fun commentary or things that we've missed, things that you think we'd enjoy, yeah, send them our way. Always down
Fanfics
to
about Belladonna
learn
Took.
more. Fanfics about Belladonna, please.
I
I'm
would
gonna go
love
search
that. I'd love
AO3
it so
for
much.
that, to be honest.
Yeah, I think I
Um,
will do the same. But with that, as we all go to look up our fanfics, both wholesome and not, thanks for hanging out with us,
mm,
everybody.
thanks so much. We'll see you next time, and remember, if a wizard shows up at your door, you really don't have a choice. You're just gonna have to go with it. Good luck.
See you next time.
See ya. The Phantom Apprentice is produced and edited by Ryn and Sam. Our music was composed and performed by James, and our art is by Casey Turgeon. This podcast is created for non-commercial entertainment purposes, and the opinions expressed therein are our own and are not reflective of the opinions of any other person or organization. The content discussed is the property of the Tolkien estate and is used here under fair use.